I'm Femi.
And I'm Malika Bilal, and you're in the stream.
Today, should mass starvation in Yemen be treated as a war crime? We'll hear the latest on what the UN calls the largest food security crisis in the world.
What can be done to end Yemen's suffering? We want to hear your thoughts on this story. You can send them to us live via our YouTube chat or on Twitter.
Extreme malnutrition and starvation. Those are the conditions faced by many people living in Yemen, where a 4-year war has left families impoverished and in desperate need of aid.
According to the UN, around 10 million Yemenis are on the edge of famine. But images like those of 12-year-old Fatima Qoba suggest otherwise. When this video was filed 2 weeks ago, Fatima weighed only 10 kilograms. Since fighting between Houthi rebels and a Saudi-led coalition started in 2015, an estimated 85,000 children under the age of 5 may have starved to death. That's according to the charity Save the Children.
So who should be held responsible for the thousands of Yemenis who have died from starvation? Joining us to talk about this in Gothenburg, Sweden, Afra Nasser, a journalist and founding editor-in-chief of the Sana Review. In Paris, Hakim Khalidi is a humanitarian worker and Yemen project coordinator for MSF. And in Oxford, in the United Kingdom, David Keane. He studies the politics of famine and is a professor of conflict studies at the London School of Economics. It's good to have you here, guests. I wish it was under better circumstances. So the UN describing what's happening in Yemen as the worst man-made humanitarian crisis of our time. Let me show our audience some of the statistics so they can kind of get it into their head what this actually looks like. So 20 million people don't have access to food or have difficult access to food. 10 million people suffering from extreme hunger. Food prices up as much as 162%. Afra, that is even hard to imagine for your family, for your friends who are in Yemen. Can you explain to us what that actually means? What are they having to deal with on a day-to-day basis?
On a day-to-day basis, every time I call my mom in Sana'a and we exchange information about the prices of food here in Sweden, where I'm based, and in Sana'a, pretty much it's the same prices. And for millions, about 2 million people in Yemen, they have not been paid their salaries from the civilian sector. That means that millions of people don't afford buying food. So these numbers are really reflecting people's inability, financial ability to get access to food and afford food. So life is pretty much very, very difficult. It's unbearable how the skyrocketing food prices are in Yemen. So food is there. It's just people are unable to buy the food.
Afrah, what you're saying there is completely echoing what we're seeing online here. This is a group that calls themselves the Yemen Polling Center, and they surveyed Yemenis. This is data from 2017, but they write in that the people that they talked to believe that access to food was getting worse. 33% of the people said that high prices were responsible for making that access to food so difficult. Others said that it was the salary crisis, as you mentioned, that was responsible for the lack of access to food. There's food in markets, but people don't have the money to buy it. They go on to say that half of those Yemenis that they talked to who had a paying job lost their income due to the war. The state's inability to pay salaries affects roughly a third of the Yemeni population. And this encouraged many men to join battlefronts to feed family. Many households are now women-led, altering gender roles. Afra, I know you wanted to jump in there on that, but they're saying that this has shifted things in families.
This is very important because today it was a big day with the internationally, the international led pledging conference for Yemen. But it's not really the direct violence in the conflict that is creating the humanitarian crisis. It is the consequences of the conflict, the economy aspect of the conflict. It is what it has a devastating impact on the people more than the violence.
Hakim, I see you nodding. Go ahead.
I totally agree with Afrah. The conflict brought an economic crisis, There is also an embargo since 2015 imposed by the Saudi-led coalition, who imposed drastically restriction regarding the trade and the economical exchange. There is also a high level of pauperization of the Yemenis, who don't have enough resources to buy food. But at the opposite, there is food on the market. When you go to Sana'a and even to Hodeidah city, for example, there is food on the market, there is fruit, there is vegetables. The problem is for the people how to access this food. The consequence of this economic crisis, it is that the people don't have enough financial resources, but at the same time, there is a UN agency, the World Food Programme, who is bringing food to Yemen. So people cannot buy food, but at the same time, there is humanitarian assistance who is bringing food to the country.
David, I'm just thinking, because you study famine and politics and conflict all mixed up together. Now, we're not saying that this is a famine because there are particular circumstances under which a famine is actually declared. But when you see what is unfolding in Yemen, is that a blueprint for what has happened in other places? And is it done on purpose to basically terrorize civilians?
Well, I think it is something that we've seen many times, is the intentional creation of famine, whether that's for economic or political or military purposes. It's certainly something that's been very, very common in Sudan, and we've seen it in many other countries as well, like Ethiopia, some time ago. So I think if we look at Yemen, you can look at it as an economic crisis, and it clearly is an economic crisis. And this is part of what happens in a famine. You have often food in the market, but people who are particularly poor can't afford to buy what there is. So that's typical, really, of a famine. And I think on top of the economic crisis, we have to take due account of the ways in which the Saudi-led coalition in particular has been waging, in effect, a kind of economic warfare, with systematic blockades, with the destruction of water processing facilities, destruction of markets, destruction of ports. This is a massive series of blows against a society that was already very vulnerable, because importing, about 90% of its food even before the war.
Hakeem, what are you thinking?
Yeah, but I think we all agree that there is an economic crisis in Yemen, which is a consequence of the conflict. We all agree also, I think, that there is food in Yemen, but it's not accessible for the population. What I described before, the level of population of the Yemenis, the fact that they don't have enough financial resources to access food, those are the key drivers for food insecurity in Yemen. Today, as MSF, we cannot say that there is a famine in Yemen. We cannot say that there are a lot of people suffering from starvation. We have many projects around Yemen. We are working. We are covering 11 governorates. We are supporting and running more than 20 medical facilities. Our beneficiaries are victims of war, wounded. We provide mother and child cares. We were also treating diphtheria and cholera, but we have also malnutrition program. On those malnutrition programs, what we observed the last years, it was an increase of chronic malnutrition. Chronic malnutrition, for everybody to know, it was already existing before this conflict. The program that we have, for example, in Amman Governorate, in Khamir, we were treating chronic malnutrition before this war. Mm-hmm. What we observed is that there is no high mortality rate, leading us to conclude that there is a famine today in Yemen. What we can say, the way we look at the situation today, it's more about a high level of food insecurity in the country.
Hakeem, so I hear you there, and I hear the fact that the disconnect between officially this has not been declared a famine, and yet people online and people saying that those in Yemen, they see the disconnect there. So look at this tweet from Nigel. He says, Yemen is standing as another example in which hunger has been used as a weapon of war. The whole negotiation in this conflict is centered on the opening of humanitarian corridors for food to move, which people say is not happening. We got a video comment from someone who's picking up on the same theme there. She wanted us to look at how she sees this as a tool of war. This is Catriona Murdoch, and she's speaking to us from The Hague.
Yemen promises to be the most severe famine in living memory. Documentation supports thousands of repeated airstrikes on agricultural areas, fisheries, markets, factories, and water infrastructure. This is in addition to the sieges and blockades, salaries going unpaid for years, and extreme inflation. These are the methods of warfare seemingly in play in Yemen. There is little doubt that these mass atrocities masquerading as natural disasters should be investigated and placed within the rubric of international criminal law.
So Afra, she mentions famine there, and as we've already confirmed, this is not a famine, but using it as a tool of war, using it as something that should be within the rubric, she says, of international criminal law. What do you make of that?
I disagree with the notion that there is not famine in Yemen. I think there is a famine. It's underway. And I think we can debate this, but I think strong states or powerful states like Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates are blocking that kind of narrative from the United Nations or any kind of report that could support these or prove that the famine is already there in Yemen, because it's going to be really like a horrific embarrassment for these countries. But I think it's very important to say that all warring parties share equal responsibility to the famine or how the country is on the verge of famine. So you have the Saudi-led coalition on one hand is blocking or having a blockade to Sana'a airport, which is, most of, according to a lot of humanitarian aid workers inside Yemen who I interviewed, most of the Yemeni population live in the north part of Yemen. So having a blockade on Sana'a airport has a devastating impact in getting a smooth access for humanitarian relief operations. And then on the other hand, you have the Houthis are also making life really hell for humanitarian workers, whether from having impossible logistics for them or having, seizing Taiz, for example, for more than 2 years and blocking also access for humanitarian aid workers were killed in Taiz.
Afra, I feel that part of this conversation has to be personal because it's about people who can't get enough food, who can't afford food. David, I want to show you this story. This is little Moeed. Moeed is 18 months old. Let's run the video because I'm going to talk about him so David can see the situation here. He's 18 months old. He weighs 3 kilos, so that's 6 pounds, David, and he's severely malnourished. Several weeks ago, his mother, Safia, brought in his 4-year-old sister, and she got treated for malnutrition. She went home, but then she later died, and his mum is now terrified that little Moeed will also die. So this is a situation that is in a conflict situation. The kids are the ones suffering. They're not even fighting. They have no politics. Who is responsible for this, David?
Well, I think, it's good to go back to the Save the Children Fund finding as well that 85,000 children have already died of starvation in their estimate in this conflict. Who is responsible? I think there is, as Afra is saying, there's responsibility on both sides. In fact, there are more than 2 sides. But there's also a primary responsibility. And sometimes these situations seem to be very complex. There's quite a high threshold for actually declaring a famine. And you find that a lot of famine deaths have already occurred in places like Somalia, 2011, South Sudan, 2017. a great number of famine deaths have already occurred by the time the international community gets around to declaring a famine because of that high threshold for declaring it. So that's a danger, I think, with labeling it as a non-famine. In terms of the responsibility, I do believe that there's a huge responsibility with, for example, the United States government, the British government, people who are arming the Saudi-led coalition. And we know that the violence that coalition has carried out has had an enormous impact on the economy in Yemen, and that this is a form of economic warfare. So sometimes the situation looks very complex, but the lines of responsibility are not as complicated as all that. And often in the West, we end up giving with one hand in terms of the humanitarian relief and feeling good about it, but we're actually taking away with the other in terms of all the signals that we're sending about who can be legitimately attacked and who can be legitimately starved in the name of one war or another. And this is the latest in a long line.
Hakeem.
Few comments. The first one, we all agree that there is food reaching Yemen, but the main question mark is, does this food reaching the beneficiaries? Because when you look at all the volume of food brought by the World Food Programme to Hodeidah port, and when you look at some press release made by some journalists regarding what have been said by the executive director of WFP on the end of 2018, saying that there is diversion of food inside the country. The second comment that I would like to do, it's about all the footage and the pictures showing a single children victim of malnutrition. When you look at all this footage and all these pictures, you can only see one single child. Why? Because there is a zoom in about a child inside a medical facility, but there is no zoom out of a number of children dying of starvation today in Yemen. I'm not saying that there is no children dying in Yemen today. The situation is very, very critical, but we are very careful about using the word famine. Also, to comment about the numbers of Save the Children, the 85,000 children who died since the beginning of the conflict in Yemen. We had a debate last week with Save the Children, and at the end of the debate, even Save the Children agree with us, MSF, saying that it's impossible to carry a qualitative survey in Yemen today and to base conclusion about quality data and figures. Why? Because it's a conflict. There are many obstacles. First one is access. Many parts of the country are not accessible for humanitarian workers, and also there is administrative constraint. To move from Sana'a to other parts of the country, you need a specific authorization for the authorities in Sana'a.
And the people responsible for that, because that's where this part of the conversation started, Femi asked who's responsible. That is what our community is reacting to. So this is Root on YouTube who says everyone is to blame for this. Iran, Saudi Arabia, America, Great Britain, Canada, France, they're all to blame. Another person picks that up sort of with despair. This is Mark Asher Goodman, and he says, this makes me frustrated and hopeless. Someone should help, but how does one fix a crisis of a civil war where the two sides are backed by reprehensible actors, Saudi Arabia and Iran? Isn't this the kind of situation for which the UN and UN peacekeeping forces were created? Afrah, what do you make of that comment?
Before I answer your question, I just want to comment that it is true, it's difficult and complicated situation to count the deaths in Yemen, but we have many reports from the local press of families committing joint suicide because of the harsh economic situation that they are in. For example, one mother fed poison to her kids, and she had the poison herself and committed suicide along with her kids because she couldn't bear surviving in this devastating war. So that is one comment. But how to proceed? I think the international community should set their priorities well when it comes to Yemen. I could, get a quote from the executive director of Oxfam today in the pledging conference. She mentioned that we need to have another pledging conference to give to those states who are trading the arms sales in order to get their own money and stop fueling this war with their arms sales. It's very important for all these stakeholders to really understand the main causes of the conflict, and that is really that they are contributing in the prolonging of the conflict without having any political solution. This is all really going to be just temporary solution.
You mentioned the Yemen Pledging Conference. I'm just looking here at a Twitter post that Kate Wiggins posted. She captures Nasser Hagamet. He's from the Islamic Relief Fund, which is a charitable organization. And he quoted to the Pledging Conference, "Our staff see grown men too frail from thirst and hunger to stand, malnourished children so weakened by hunger and preventable diseases like diarrhea that they might not make it through the day." And this may just be the perspective of this camera shot, but it doesn't look like there's an awful lot of people there. Hakeem, how do you think we can get out of this situation? What's the next step?
So today it was this conference about the UN appeal, which reached $4.3 billion this year. Last year it was $3 billion. If we go back to 2015, it was 274 millions. The way I look at it, first of all, we can say that it's the biggest financial volume for humanitarian operation. But I don't know what is the result of this pledge on the field. Again, the main question is, does the assistance reach the beneficiaries, the Yemenis? And another comment, it's how it is possible to organize such conference in order to feed the conflict. I mean, to keep the assistance and the operation, the humanitarian operation running in Yemen. The main question is how is not possible to organize the same kind of conference together all these countries to find a solution to stop the conflict. I also want to comment about who is responsible. I think, as it was said, everybody is responsible. When you see the situation that was faced by MSF, since the beginning of the conflict, we had 6 medical facilities bombed in Yemen. Today, there are more than 50% of the medical facilities are damaged or not functionable because they've been bombed also. If you look at the data for Yemen Data Project, they said that a third of the military target from the Saudi-led coalition is targeting civilian infrastructures. So the comment will be, okay, the Saudi-led coalitions are bombing Yemen, but from where does they bring those weapons to bomb Yemen? So now we can reach also the origin of the country bringing these weapons to the Saudi-led coalition.
All right. Malika, how's this conversation going down online? What are people weighing in with?
Several people saying something very similar, which is that not enough people are covering this, and this is not in enough headlines. This is someone on YouTube who says the fact that Yemen has been in this state for this long and hasn't been addressed in the mainstream media enough is a joke. And this last one is on Twitter. Zaid says, "What will Yemen look like in 10 to 15 years when half of the population will be in their teens and 20s? Either immense progress or more destruction, depending on the commitment from the global community to bring peace and stability and the U.S. involvement in Yemen."
Thank you very much to Afra, to Hakeem, and also to David for joining us here on the stream, giving us their perspective and their take on what is happening in Yemen right now with the insecurity of food and the people in Yemen actually struggling to eat. Thank you so much for joining us. We will always be online at AJ Stream on Twitter. See you next time.